Welcome to Mind Shift Power Podcast, a show for teenagers and the adults who work with them, where we have raw and honest conversations. I'm your host, Fatima Bey, the Mind Shifter. And welcome, everyone. Today we have with us Brian Sachetta. He is from Boston, Massachusetts area. And he's an author and a mental health advocate. He's also the owner of Get Out of Your Head. It's a book, it's a brand, and it's a community. As he says, it has a no bullshit approach to mental health. Today, we're going to focus on isolation. How are you doing today, Brian?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks, Fatima, and I hope you're doing well, too.
I am. I'm looking forward to this conversation. One of the reasons I noticed you was the no bullshit approach to mental health. That phrase actually made me pay attention to you because I absolutely love it.
That's cool. Good marketing.
One of the reasons. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying that's great. It's effective marketing, then. Yeah,
it is. It attracts, I think, the right people. Because I have the same mentality. So we're going to talk about isolation, what that is, what it isn't, why it matters. But one of the things that you say on your website, and I've heard others say, that there's a mental health crisis. And to that I say, what mental health crisis with our youth?
Yeah, there's none. There's clearly none, right?
We're all perfect, yeah.
Yeah, pretty interesting. There's a newsletter that I read every day that kind of encapsulates or sums down all the news that about the markets and finance and just stories that you might want to know about, right? And so there was a story in it this week about this new book by Jonathan Haidt. He wrote a previous book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And this new book is called The Anxious Generation. And the book and then also the article are focused on the fact that we have a youth mental health crisis, right? And his book, which I actually just finished, was centered around the idea that kids used to grow up in a play-based society, right? Where it was like they had a childhood where they were in front of kids all the time, playing and figuring out how to interact with different kids and grow up and learn relationships and all that. And now they are being put through what is called, what I guess Haidt would call a phone-based childhood. And the difficulty with something like that, right, is it leads to a lot of isolation, but then it also doesn't necessarily allow kids the development they need in terms of having face-to-face conversations with people, like learning and understanding what, tone of voice is and body, body movements and posture and all those sorts of subtle cues in conversations that help us figure out what the other person is expressing, right? And so his whole book is looking at the youth mental health crisis from a broad lens, and then also offering some ideas as to what parents and educators might be able to do to help mitigate this new crisis. So I thought the book was really interesting. I thought it was effective and great. And it also just feeds into the conversation that we're having, where there is a serious crisis, and it's not just affecting, people who live in cities that are a little bit older and single, right? It's like, it's now across the board, and it's affecting kids as well. And I have a niece and a nephew, and I'm reading this book and I'm like, it's kind of terrifying to think about the fact that they will be going through this process soon of, what Haidt says is the phone-based childhood. And, the wheels in my mind start turning and thinking about, like, how do I help mitigate some of that crisis for them as they grow up,
But why is it a crisis? I mean, phones are great. We can look at stuff and we can learn more stuff and we can do stuff on the phone. I mean, we don't need to talk to other people, right?
So, I mean, obviously it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question, right? And, you go back to how we evolved as a species, right? And I don't have all the answers. I don't know if anybody necessarily does, but even if you went back a few thousand years, right? And you said, okay, humans for a long time have lived in small tribes. They have, technology is a brand new invention in the context of human history, right? And so the way that our brains evolved and the way that we are wired centers around face-to-face interaction, the same sorts of things I mentioned a minute ago, where it's like there are so many things that get lost when we send a text message, right? You don't hear tone of voice. You can't pick up on the body language that I have and whatnot. Yeah. And so the sort of I don't know if it's trite, but the sort of the example that might be given at, say, a comedy show or something, right, is somebody reading out a transcript of a text conversation in a courtroom, right? And the person, somebody saying like, yes, no, whatever, right? And there's just so much lost when you boil down
Yes.
a conversation to just the text, right? Just what
Yeah.
is spoken. When you actually think about all those subtle cues, if somebody's like playing with you, right? And they're saying like, no, right? And you think about that and you're like, that person is communicating something under the words themselves. And so getting back to the question that you asked of, phones are great and all that, right? There are things that phones are great for. However, they've become a big part of our lives, right? And I think that as we sit at home on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and whatnot, we see a lot of things that scare us, right? There's the notion of doom scrolling. There's also the idea of comparing ourselves to other people on social media, and the idea that on social media, right, we are projecting images of ourselves that are not fully accurate, right? We are putting highlight reels into the world. And then it's kind of fascinating and terrifying at the same time. I talked about this in one of my blog posts where if you think about it, like let's say I post a bunch of doctored photos on Instagram and then you do the same, or maybe a better example might be like, two boys or two girls, right, who are friends. Let's say the girl, is looking at her friend's pictures and being like, she might see these pictures and say, oh my goodness, my friend is so attractive and having so much fun. Why is my life not like that? And that makes that person feel terrible, right? Yeah. On the other side of the fence, the girl who's posting those pictures and getting that reaction may feel the same way about her friend. And so in theory, we might be creating a lot of agony for ourselves. That is like, not only it's undue agony, but it also like, it's just this weird debacle of like, we might all be making ourselves miserable in an attempt to stand out when I think the net effect of all of that might be pretty bad.
Those are some great examples. I'm going to pull out from what you said is go back to one of the things you said a little earlier in that statement. Humans need each other. We are built for that. And so with that, I want to go into explain to the audience, primarily the adults, what is isolation? And why does it matter?
Sure. I think there's a couple ways to answer that or look at it, right? So I think what most of us jump to in our minds is isolation being, and I'll come back to a better definition in a second, but being physically isolated from other people, right? Ostracized or separated from other people. Try not to use the definition of the word try not to use the word in the definition of the word itself. But anyway, I digress. So we think about, okay, if I am isolated, it means I'm not surrounded by other people. I'm not connected with other people. There is certainly a physical aspect to isolation, right? But I think probably the more important piece is the emotional aspect, right? Because there's also an idea of being, lost in a crowd, right? If you go downtown or into the city or whatever, and you're at a parade, just because you are surrounded by other people doesn't mean that you are necessarily connected with those people. Isolation, in terms of how it makes us feel, right? The feeling piece is the most important part. And so, you may go out to dinner with one friend and you might be in a forest. And in theory, or, you could argue that the two of you are isolated. However, emotionally, if you're having a good conversation and connecting with this person, you're not isolated from one another, right? And so the important piece when looking at isolation is asking ourselves, are we physically isolated? Because that is something. But more importantly, are we emotionally isolated? Because when we hold emotions inside, they tend to grow and fester, right? And that's not a good place to be. But then also just the fact that you said, right, we all need each other. That is how we are wired. And so even if, it's not like every time you get together with people, you need to have the most spiritual or emotional conversation. Sometimes just getting together with the guys or the gals and shooting the breeze can be a really effective thing for our minds and our psyches, So I definitely think about all of those different topics when it comes to isolation. And I guess the last piece, just talking about the effect of it. There's definitely some research that has come out in the last few years saying that isolation is reportedly as dangerous to our health as smoking cigarettes. And, I think about that where I live by myself. I'm single. I try to get out there and socialize with people, but there are times where it's easier than others. And I look at research like that and it scares me, and it makes me want to change my habits a little bit and get more involved in my community and whatnot.
I think also to add to pick up on a little bit of what you just said, when we are too isolated, it is very easy to go down a mental rabbit hole that is basically a booby trap that you just can't get out of by yourself. It's very easy to go down a rabbit hole of, oh my God, I'm the only one going through this. And that is almost never true. A lot of times, one of the reasons we suffer so much is because we don't open up to one another to say, hey, I'm suffering with this. And then someone turns around and go, wait a minute, I'm suffering with that too. It's not just me. I mean, I just think about imposter syndrome as an example. And that's something I absolutely suffered from, especially in my bridal business for a long time. And it held me back. That was one of the, it held me back from growing my business like I could have and should have at the time. I eventually got over it later, but, it's the isolation of keeping it all to yourself. And I also want to point out, you and reiterate something you said. You talked about the mental isolation, because that's really what we're talking about. Physical isolation, that's easy. And I think we all can understand that. But I think most people don't even recognize, and not just teens, when they themselves are in a mentally isolated place. And I'm going to just say this. If you, to listeners, if you're in a place where everything inside your head stays there and no one else knows about it, you're probably, and I mean everything, you're probably isolated in a bad way. And I don't mean that everybody needs to know your business and you don't use any wisdom, you tell everybody everything. That's bad too. But what I'm saying is that that's one way to look at yourself, because I think a lot of people don't recognize when they themselves are in isolation. And I've been a Lone Ranger thinker most of my life, so I really, really get that. It's difficult to trust people, and sometimes you're just like, you're on a different level than most people around you. It's very difficult to talk to people, and open up until you find someone else who's actually on your level. And I know that I'm not just talking about myself when I say that, because I know it's not just me. But I think that the mental isolation piece is critical, and recognizing that when we're in that. So with that, I want to ask, let's discuss, why do we think that this generation is in an isolated space? Because you can be, and I've seen this because I work with teenagers all the time, go to high schools and speak to them and do workshops, etc. When you see a group of teenagers in a room, there could be 20 people in the room, yet they're all alone. That happens most of the time, actually, more often than not. You go to a networking event, you're all supposed to be talking and networking for adults, right? And it could be 100 people in the room, but there's really only about 5, because everybody's isolated themselves and they're only giving plastic answers and, not having real conversations. They're just having plastic conversations, as I like to call it. I'm sorry, I asked you a question, then I went on. So let me go back to that question, because I'm very passionate about this subject, as you could probably tell. So go ahead and answer the question before I go on to the next one.
Yeah, so let me just restate the question. I think it was, why is the current generation, or the young generation at the moment, why do they find themselves falling prey to isolation maybe more often? Is that kind of a good way?
Yeah, that's another way to put it. Yep.
Okay, so I think the example you gave of networking and whatnot, I think that was actually important, because I feel like there are two pieces here. So there's the human nature of, we are scared to talk to one another and connect with one another, right? Especially if you are introverted. Some extroverts that I know, they will go into a room full of people they've never seen before and just shoot the breeze with everybody. I think that's a bad expectation to set for listeners, right? Because that personality type is relatively rare. I think most people are a little bit self-conscious, and they question themselves and their ability to talk to people. And they think, oh, what'll happen if I go up to this person and I ask the wrong question, or I look like a fool, or they don't want to talk to me, right? So there is that aspect of human nature that is just indelible, right? All of us deal with that, not only me and you, but also, let's say, kids who are in middle school right now, kids who are in high school. And one of the other difficulties, right, when you are young, not that every age and generation doesn't have its own challenges, but when you are young, like, you just don't know a lot, right? And so kids are mean, and you think about bullies in grade school and whatnot, and the fact that, like, there are so many things that, for myself, right, I dealt with mental health issues throughout grade school. I would have never, and I never spoke about those issues to anybody at the time. And that is really just a product of, like, being a kid and being scared, right? And so as you get older and you learn more information, maybe you say to yourself, hey, I have actually learned that, for example, 1 out of 5 people in the US deals with a mental health condition every year. You start to compile that information, and then say to yourself, hey, you know what? Maybe it's not so weird or different or obscure to deal with some of these things. And then with a conclusion like that on your side, maybe you're more willing to confront your anxiety, or take that anxiety and say, you know what? I might be nervous right now, but I'm going to go have a conversation with somebody, or I'm going to talk about this difficult topic to somebody, right? You just open up more. You become a little bit more willing to discuss things as you get older, I think, especially as you gain more information. So there's the piece of being a kid, being a human, and it being difficult to open up to other people, being scared that you might get rejected or whatever it may be. I think to answer the next part of I said there was 2 parts, right? So the first part is just human nature in general. The second part is the fact that, like, if you look at the technology that is being given to kids these days, right? It's a new phenomenon in the sense that, like, when I went to middle school and high school, we had AOL Instant Messenger, right? And we had Nintendo 64. It was a very different kind of technology. And I'm sure the seeds were being planted, but it was a different kind of technology than exists today. And if you look at the technology that is now in kids' hands, it's iPhones, it's mobile apps, it's social media, it's online gaming. And those, and also, I mean, I hate to say it, but, pornography, there are a lot of things out there that are, dangerous for kids, right? And I'm not trying to sound like the unhip, old guy or whatever, right? But like, if I go back to being in 6th grade and I'm like, somebody gave me a cell phone with Instagram on it, and I played, shooter games online with my friends, and I, had access to all these illicit, maybe not illicit, but like questionable websites, right? It's sort of like giving a potent substance to somebody who, like, has no experience with that yet, right?
Yeah.
Their brain has not yet developed. Their frontal lobe is far from completion of its development. And so I think, going back to Jonathan Haidt's point of, kids are, their entire lives, right? Their childhood is becoming phone-based or phone primary rather than play primary or connection primary. That's a difficult thing. And then also, you just think about the fact that, okay, so if you are in middle school and you get access to a phone and social media and all that, this stuff is engineered, right? I'm a software developer. I can tell you firsthand that we engineer mobile apps, and I'm sure other software, it's the same. You could say the same thing. We engineer these programs to either be addictive, or at the very least, we engineer them so that way we can find what the most engaging or interesting experience will be, and then we serve that up to our users, right? And so you take that to its extreme, and you say, okay, on a social media app, we're going to send you information that gets your emotions going and makes you want to share content and whatnot. And sure, like, these platforms have businesses to run, and I get that. But you put that technology in the hands of an 11-year-old, and all of a sudden, we're talking scary territory here. So I will stop there. But I think those are the 2 main things, right? The human nature in general, and then just the fact that we're giving very powerful technologies to young kids. And I would argue that they're probably not ready for them. And that's no slight on them. It's like, I don't even know if necessarily every adult is ready for this stuff, and it's powerful. So I'll pause there.
I think you said that perfectly. The technology piece is not a minor detail, but I want to back up and say something to everyone listening. We as adults constantly use the term social media, but if you're a teenager growing up today, there's no such thing as social media. It's just media. And I say that because those of us who are 30 and above, we grew up when social media was just budding. So to us, it was separate media. But to the teenager, they've only known social media is everything. There is no other anything. Social media is the world. It is all of existence to a teenage mind who's growing up in today's society. And I'm saying that because I think most of us don't understand that as adults, most of us adults rather don't understand that our thinking on that is very different than theirs. There is no social media. Social media is a part of the existing world, period. They don't watch the local news. They don't even know who the local news anchors are. They don't watch CNN unless they're watching a clip of it on YouTube Shorts or somebody's, using it on TikTok or Instagram. To them, that is the world. What we used to consider television, what we used to consider the main source of getting our information about the world and our culture, that's not their source anymore. And it's around them 24/7. Information, but more than just information. Infiltration. Here's the stuff we want you to learn. Here's how we want you to think. And this is what they're constantly bombarded with. As human beings across this earth, we've always been bombarded with, here's how we want you to think. I don't care what culture you're from, what country you're from, what race you're from, blah, blah, blah. Every culture does that because that's part of human nature. But never in time before the past 20 years has it been the case where you're inundated with it literally 24/7. If you have any sort of electronic, any sort of digital, anything around you. So and again, I'm mostly saying that to the adults listening. When you say social media, that's your term. That's not theirs. There is no social media to them. It's just media. It's everything. Think about it. A 2-year-old nowadays is growing up with a phone in their hand. I have literally watched 2-year-olds scroll through social media, scroll through a phone better than a 30-year-old. And I am not exaggerating. I have physically seen that with my eyes. And I know it's not just that child. That's how they're growing up with. And I'm saying that because I really think it's extremely important to emphasize these facts to the adults listening. Because if they don't understand, I think many of them, and this is one of the reasons I started this podcast, is there's such a large disconnect between adults and our youth. And yes, they're growing up in a different world, but I think we tend not to really fully recognize what a big freaking deal that is. And that plays into this conversation of why they're feeling so isolated, because all they know is social media. And if they're not getting attention on that, we're supposed to get attention from other humans around us. Believe it or not, that's actually foreign to a lot of them. The younger they are, the more foreign that is to them. So having said all of that, Brian, what do you think is the solution? Now I'm talking about our youth. For those who are growing up in this era, this is all they know, and it's not their fault. This is all they know. It's our fault who are older than them because we shoved this crap in their face. So for those teenagers who maybe are listening to this and starting to recognize, maybe I am too isolated, what can they do from where they are?
It's a good question, and I will say I agree with everything that you just mentioned. It's a hard question to answer because there's a lot of different levels at which we could look at this, right? So first level being, what can an individual do? Next level being maybe, what can a parent do? Next level being a school board or a district. And then next level being a state, a country, whatever, right? I think starting at the lowest level, it's going to be kind of hard, right? Because as an 11-year-old, and I'm just kind of pulling that number out of thin air. Mm-hmm. It could be 13, could be 7, whatever. The all-consuming, all-encompassing nature of social media, as you so eloquently put a minute ago, that tends to blind you from other things that are going on in your world, right? So if all you know is Snapchat and Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and I don't even know some of the apps that kids are on these days, if that is your life, then it might, you kind of only know what you know. And almost
Right.
People sometimes refer to like Plato's allegory of the cave, right? And it's like, I guess I won't get into it all the way, but if people want to look that up online, it's basically the notion of like what your reality looks like may not always be as it appears, right? And so
Right.
for kids,
Yeah.
their reality may be that social media is reality. It is
Right.
the world. It is everything.
Right.
The difficulty with that is that if all they're doing is, I'm going to say air quotes, connecting with friends online, posting things online, watching videos, they might just be watching videos and consuming content of stuff that they enjoy or they care about, or maybe it scares them, but it grips them in some way.
Mm-hmm.
It might be hard for them to break out of that bubble, right? To break out of that cave and say, oh, I now have awareness that social media is not everything, and I need to get off social media once in a while. So it's hard to answer this question specifically because every situation will be different, and it's going to take some, penetration of that reality, either from a parent or from maybe we get lucky and a kid watches a video that wakes them up a little bit or whatever, right? But at some point, there has to be some awareness to say, like, to have that child or kid say, look, the way that I'm living is maybe harmful, right? Maybe I should not be on these apps all the time. And so I think the first thing would be, right, the first recommendation I would give is like, for somebody who is, let's say they're listening to this podcast, and that is sort of the penetration of the reality, right? Of somebody saying, hey, I have been woken up, so to speak, to this new reality and the dangers of social media. Then my recommendation to somebody who might be listening would be to say, hey, you might be on your device all day outside of school, or maybe even in school a little bit. Give yourself 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hours
Yes.
every day to do something that has nothing to do with technology. Maybe that's play with your siblings. Maybe that's, go to your neighbor's house and, like, if you know that a classmate lives there, knock on the door and be like, hey, do you want to ride bikes? Do you want to, shoot hoops in the driveway? Whatever it may be. Going back to that point I made at the beginning of the conversation of like the importance of play, the importance of developing an ability to read people's body language and understand, the nuances of conversation. That only comes through real in-person, real world conversations and relationships.
Yes.
And so we need kids who are listening to reconnect to the real world, right? And find ways to cultivate real relationships in the real world. The next levels that I would say would be like, if parents are listening, right? There are a few things that you could do. You could maybe put on, so there is on some of the mobile devices, right? There are parental controls. So you can, I don't use them because I don't have kids, but you can specify what kids can and can't do on the device and maybe set, timers and limits and stuff like that. Consider maybe using those controls so that way, hey, if your kid wants to go online and you're okay with it and all his friends are online and he feels like if he doesn't go online, he'll be bullied, then maybe there's an argument for that. But make sure that it doesn't become all consuming where, you send him to his room and you think he's going to bed and he's on his iPad for like 4 hours, right? And doing things that you wouldn't want him to do. So parental controls, and then also like get involved, right? At the school board level where, talk to your teachers, see what's happening in the classroom and try to instill, an understanding with some of the administrators that like, there's a problem here and we need to figure this out. I think about it because I'm like, I don't have kids. I would like to have kids at some point in my life, but I am a little bit nervous of like, how does this all shake out? And what would I do as a parent? I don't know, right? Because the argument is, all right, you may say, my kid is not going to get a cell phone until 16. Right now, that sounds like a decent idea because you're like, well, then they will not be subjected to all these scary forces online and they will build relationships and know what the real world is like. However, in practice, when you get down to it, things are not always that simple, right? Maybe the kid comes home at 13 or 11 and says, Mom, Dad, everybody picks on me because everybody else is online and I'm not online. And they started a group chat called like everybody in the classroom except for Brian, and they're all making fun of Brian in the group chat, right? So there's a lot of nuances here, and there's a lot of difficulty. What I would say is like it's a balance of like implementing some strategies on your own, but then also thinking about the culture and kind of reading that, right? Where like you don't, if the goal is to have healthy, happy kids, whether they're your own or just the generation in general. And so if we, like that, if that is the goal, then we really need to make sure that we are kind of getting a lay of the land and not just implementing certain things. For example, to say like, hey, my kid's not going to get a cell phone till 16, 18, that could have unintended negative consequences. So we got to think about all those possible ramifications and then just make the best decisions we can, knowing that it's a really difficult subject.
I want to add to that. I think that to summarize a lot of what you said would be the key word of balance, which is something I'm always talking about. And that is that you want to make sure that you're giving them freedom, but you don't want to give them so much freedom that they're falling over a cliff with their phone in their hand. And you don't want to be so strict that they just end up going crazy anyway, because that's what happens when we're too strict with our kids. They always find ways around it, because where there's a will, there's a way. And you can restrict whatever you want on their phone, but that's okay. They're going to borrow Kendra's phone and she'll let her do it. There's just ways around it. There's just so many ways around it. So I think the key thing is to the teenagers listening, it's you we're talking about, and you are the one that has to decide your future, because no matter what we do, you're the one who's got to live it, not us. And if you really want to be better than your peers, one up from your peers, and I said it just like that, if you want to be one up from your peers, then you are the one that's going to have to make the decision right now that you want to be better connected to humanity than they are. And so what that looks like is you have to make a decision that, you know what, Tuesday from 3 to 4, I'm turning my phone off and I'm taking my little brother to the park and we're going to play ball. Or Saturdays from 6 to 7, I'm going to play Uno with my little sister and everything gets turned off. So the problem isn't that you don't take your little brother to the park or play Uno with your sister. The problem is that you don't turn your phone off and it rules you while you're doing everything else. So if you really, as a youth, want to make that decision that you want to be one up from the rest of your peers, where you actually have human connection, which also means you're likely to get further than them in certain areas, especially professionally. You have to make that decision that, you know what, I'm gonna just take a break for a little bit. I will tell you, I see people do this all the time. Adults do this, but this is not an age thing. So you could do the same thing as a teenager and get the exact same results. It really doesn't matter. So I've seen adults who are like, you know what, I'm staying off social media for a day, for 3 days, whatever their time frame is. 100% of the time, they come back and say, oh my God, I feel refreshed. It's like taking a good shower. You get cleansed from all the crap that's on all around you at all time. There's a lot of great things on media. There really is, but there's just as much garbage. There's just as many things making you feel insecure. There's just as many things making you feel unaccomplished, making you feel less than, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're a teenager, listen, I really want to emphasize it. Really, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what us adults do or what we try to do. It's up to you. If you really want to be better than your peers, you want to be one up. And I'm wording it like that because I know that's the wording that'll reach you. Then you've got to make a change and do something different than everybody else is doing. Stop falling in line and just being another piece of cattle like everybody else, because you're going to end up a robot like them too. If you want to be one up, hey, start making differences and changes now. Doesn't matter what everybody else does or doesn't accept or doesn't like it. I promise you they'll start to respect you for it after a while because they don't have the guts to do it. And that ends my speech there. Now, I just had to say that. Now, Brian, I want to start wrapping this up, and I want the audience to understand a little bit more about you and what you do, because I think you're very good at the things that you focus on. Brian focuses on a lot of other subjects. We wanted to talk about isolation today, but if you could tell the audience a little bit more about what you do and how they can find you.
For sure. So I am a mental health advocate, an author, a blogger, all those good things, right? My work focuses on anxiety and depression. So I have a book on anxiety, a book on depression, talking about managing both diseases or conditions, possibly overcoming them. And one of the reasons why I was so intrigued by this conversation topic of isolation is that depression and isolation can go hand in hand. And so I've done some research and some writing into both of those topics. And it's something that's important and near and dear to my heart. If folks want to get in touch with me or find some of my work, you can go to getoutofyourhead.com. So there's no dashes, no spaces in that. It's all kind of one word, getoutofyourhead.com. The place where I'm active most on social media or media would be Instagram at the moment. So the account there for the writing is Get Out of Your Head as the handle, if you will. All one word as well. No dashes, no spaces there. It's always great, even though it's great to have these conversations, even though the topics are scary and unsettling and have, real world and possibly large ramifications. But, I have these conversations with folks like yourself, and I like talking about this stuff because mental health is really important to me. It is something that I have struggled with in my life. And after making some progress with my own mental health, I felt like I was so passionate about the topic that I wanted to share what I had learned with others. And so that's why I continue to have conversations like this, because I know there's a lot of people out there that struggle with this stuff. And I want to just put the message out there that it's okay to struggle. And to be honest, it's pretty normal, pretty natural. It's a part of, the human condition. And so I'm just getting out there, trying to spread the word in any which way I can. And hope to hear from some folks that are listening.
Well, Brian, thank you much. Thank you very much for coming on, and to the audience listening. I hope that you can hear his sincerity. And I will tell you, just from the off-air conversations that we had, this man is very sincere. It's one of the reasons I had him on. I don't like people that can talk about concepts, but that's all they can do is talk about a concept, and don't come from a place of actually really understanding it. And you do. So if you want to talk to somebody who's genuinely sincere about helping other people and helping you, Brian's one of those. And unfortunately, I think that they're more rare than they should be. But the sincerity is something that I really appreciate about you. And thank you once again for coming on and having this conversation.
And thanks for having me, Fatima. It was a pleasure.
And now for a mind-shifting moment. I'm looking to talk to a particular person out there today. Are you feeling lonely? Did it ever occur to you that maybe one of the reasons you're feeling lonely is because you keep yourself too isolated? Sometimes we can have all these people around us, yet we feel so alone. And we're not physically alone, but we are alone because we have chosen to mentally isolate ourselves. Is that you? Do you feel totally alone amongst all these humans? I want you to know you don't have to be. What you need to do is find the right person or people to actually begin to open up to and allow somebody in so that you don't have to feel so alone anymore. That loneliness is the foundation for depression. It is the gateway to so many, many, many other things. I just want you to think about that. Thank you for listening to Mindshift Power Podcast. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel at The Mindshifter. If you have any comments, topic suggestions, or would like to be a guest on the show, please visit fatimabay.com/podcast. Remember, there's power in shifting your thinking. Tune in for next week.